The quiet observer. The refrigerator's soft purr was the dominant sound in Milo's apartment, a comforting counterpoint to the quiet ebb of a Tuesday evening. Rain traced a hushed rhythm on the window pane, a gentle serenade that harmonized with the warmth emanating from his ceramic mug. Earl Grey, perfectly steeped, unfurled citrus-scented tendrils of steam, intertwining with the faint aroma of aged paper and dust clinging to the volumes that lined his walls. Deep into a sweeping historical novel, he was lost in the intricacies of a vanished empire, his thumb idly caressing the page's worn edge. This was his sanctuary, a meticulously curated haven of muted tones and yielding textures, where monumental dramas unfolded solely within the printed word. And the only company he truly desired was the serene introspection of his own thoughts. A sudden, discordant clang from the hallway fractured the stillness. Milo started, nearly spilling tea onto the open book. He carefully placed the mug on its coaster, his brow furrowed in annoyance. Moving day, he recalled with a sigh. The apartment opposite, vacant for weeks, was at last receiving a new inhabitant. He'd noted the for rent sign's disappearance, but hadn't anticipated such an immediate sonic invasion. More thuds followed, punctuated by the bright trill of a woman's laughter. Milo's gaze drifted involuntarily toward his front door, a sliver of curiosity eclipsing his penchant for solitude. He pictured the scene, a jumble of boxes, organized chaos, the polite but weary smiles of new acquaintances assisting with an unfamiliar space. He'd always loathed moving, the disruption, the stilted exchanges with movers, the unsettling transformation of a familiar home into something alien, shrouded in tape and cardboard. He attempted to return to his novel, but the words swam before him. The sounds from across the hall intensified. A man's deeper, resonant voice cut through the clamor, followed by a new chorus of interwoven laughter. Milo imagined a small gathering, perhaps a celebratory unpacking. He struggled to re-engage with his story, but the narrative now felt flimsy, distant, overshadowed by the very tangible activity mere feet away. The ensuing days brought a flurry of activity from the neighboring unit. The door often stood ajar, offering glimpses of cardboard and, more consistently, a procession of women. Young, stylish, and always impeccably dressed, their laughter drifted easily through the thin partition. They arrived laden with takeout, decorative flourishes, and bottles of wine. Milo would catch snippets of their conversations as he retrieved his mail or disposed of recycling. Hushed confidences, playful teasing, discussions of art, travel, and upcoming gallery openings. Sebastian, the new tenant, remained an elusive figure initially. Milo's encounters were fleeting, a tall man with dark hair that always seemed artfully disheveled, exuding an aura of effortless cool. He moved with an unhurried self-assurance, an innate charm that seemed to draw people to him. Occasionally, he would emerge into the corridor, offering a quick, almost imperceptible nod if his gaze met Milo's. It was a polite, detached acknowledgement, nothing more. Sebastian was perpetually surrounded, perpetually engaged, his attention never lingering. One evening, Milo found himself pausing by his peephole, a new, unconscious habit. He watched Sebastian, looking unusually relaxed in a plain t-shirt, leaning against his apartment's doorframe. Two women faced him, one playfully swatting his arm, the other giggling. Sebastian smiled, a genuine, easy expression that softened his features, revealing a less guarded persona than Milo typically observed. He said something, too low for Milo to discern, and the women erupted in fresh mirth. Then, with a final wave, they descended the stairwell. Sebastian watched them go, his smile slowly receding as he closed his door. A familiar constriction tightened in Milo's chest, a quiet ache that resonated with the profound silence of his own apartment. He was accustomed to it, of course. His life was meticulously constructed around quietude. He cherished his evenings with books, his weekend forays into the botanical gardens, the simple pleasure of brewing the perfect cup of tea. He didn't crave constant company, didn't yearn for the vibrant social world that seemed to orbit Sebastian. And yet, witnessing it, observing the effortless camaraderie, the natural magnetism, stirred something within him. It was a peculiar strain of loneliness, not a crushing despair, but a gentle, persistent hum beneath the surface of his contentment, like a faint echo in a vast, empty chamber. He had friends, of course, a small, intimate circle he met for dinner occasionally. His family was loving and supportive, albeit geographically distant. But the daily intimacy, the casual presence of another person, that was conspicuously absent. He retreated from the peephole, a touch ashamed of his voyeurism. Entering his living room, the scattered books and half-finished crosswords suddenly felt less like cherished companions and more like stark reflections of his solitary existence. He picked up his novel again, but the words seemed flat, the Empire's ancient struggles trivial beside the subtle complexities of human connection. He pictured Sebastian inside his new apartment, perhaps still smiling, perhaps already absorbed in something new. He heard the women's laughter echoing in his mind. He went to the kitchen and brewed another cup of tea, a chamomile blend this time, hoping to quell the unexpected restlessness that had taken root. He knew himself to be a quiet observer, a watcher from the sidelines. It was his nature, and most of the time, he was entirely content with that. But tonight, the stark contrast between the bustling energy across the hall and the profound stillness of his own space felt particularly acute. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the rain continue its steady descent, a quiet, insistent rhythm that seemed to mirror the unspoken longings in his own heart. The world outside, and just across the hall, continued its vibrant, noisy existence. And Milo, the quiet observer, remained precisely where he was, watching, wondering, and waiting. A wall of silence. The calendar blurred. Seasons marked less by dates than by the shifting panorama across the hall. Spring's tentative embrace yielded to summer's oppressive humidity, then to autumn's crisp, melancholic exhalation. Through it all, Sebastian remained a fixture, invariably distant. Milo, within his meticulously ordered apartment, became an unwitting chronicler of Sebastian's vibrant, ever-evolving social sphere. From his living room window, Milo often caught fleeting glimpses. Sebastian's apartment, once a silent enigma, now pulsed with a low thrum of life. New faces constantly appeared, mostly women, their laughter echoing faintly in the stairwell, occasionally carried to Milo's floor on a favorable breeze. He'd observe Sebastian on his balcony, leaning against the railing, a drink in hand, head thrown back in mirth at a comment from a dark-haired woman in a flowing sundress. Another evening, a different woman, her fiery red hair, a striking cascade, perched on the planter box, her hand resting lightly on Sebastian's arm as they shared an intimate, hushed conversation. Sebastian's entrance, directly opposite Milo's, functioned as a revolving door. Keys jingled, low voices murmured goodbyes, and the scent of unfamiliar perfumes occasionally permeated the sterile hallway air. Milo would hear the soft click of Sebastian's door closing, followed by the lighter tap of another's departure, always with that polite, almost formal distance. Never a lingering embrace, never a passionate kiss goodbye visible through the peephole. It was also refined, so quintessentially Sebastian, What most struck Milo was Sebastian's unwavering obliviousness to his presence. He might be leaving for groceries just as Sebastian escorted a striking blonde in a tailored jumpsuit. Their paths would converge in the narrow hallway, a mere 6 feet separating them. Yet Sebastian's gaze would skim over Milo as if he were an extension of the wall decor. No nod, no polite smile, not even an acknowledgement of shared space. It was a consistent, almost deliberate oversight that settled upon Milo, not with anger, but with a peculiar weight of invisibility. It was as if Sebastian had erected an impenetrable, silent barrier, and Milo remained perpetually on the other side, an unseen observer. Milo found himself developing an unusual familiarity with Sebastian's habits. He learned to anticipate the late-night laughter, the morning coffee aroma that occasionally seeped under Sebastian's door, the varied cadence of female voices. He recognized the deeper silence that indicated Sebastian was home alone, broken only by the faint thrum of jazz, a surprising choice for such an outwardly gregarious man. His own routine, once a wellspring of comfort, began to feel like a well-worn path leading nowhere. He still prepared his single-serving pour-over coffee, still arranged his books by color and height, still spent evenings immersed in weighty tomes. But now, an undercurrent of restlessness vibrated beneath the surface. He'd catch himself pausing, book half open, listening for the telltale sounds from across the hall. He'd dismiss it as mere curiosity, a natural consequence of a new, vibrant neighbor after years of hushed quiet. Yet, the persistent awareness of Sebastian, juxtaposed with the stark quietude of his own life, began to erode the carefully constructed facade of his contentment. "It's fine," he'd murmur to himself, the words tasting flat and unconvincing in the quiet air of his apartment. "This is how I prefer it. Solitude. Order." One blustery October evening, as winter's first bite sharpened the air, Milo found himself at his window again. Sebastian was on his balcony, but this time he wasn't with one of his usual companions. Instead, he was animatedly conversing with Lila, a woman Milo had seen frequently. Stylish and possessing an easy laugh, she radiated a pragmatic confidence. She wasn't one of Sebastian's fleeting acquaintances. She seemed more like a friend, a grounding presence amidst the carousel of others. Lila leaned against the railing, arms crossed, listening intently as Sebastian recounted something, his hands gesturing expansively. He was different tonight, less performative, more relaxed. The effortless charm persisted, but it was softened, infused with a genuine warmth Milo hadn't witnessed before. He saw a flicker of something unguarded in Sebastian's eyes as he looked at Lila, a brief moment of vulnerability quickly masked. Suddenly, Lila's rich, full laugh cut through the wind. She nudged Sebastian's arm playfully, then pointed towards the sky. Sebastian followed her gaze, his expression shifting from animated storytelling to a quiet contemplation. They stood there for a long moment, side by side, simply looking up at the bruised purple sky. No grand pronouncements, no dramatic gestures, just two people sharing a quiet, companionable moment. Milo watched until the chill drove Lila inside, Sebastian following shortly after. This brief tableau left Milo with a hollow ache he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't envy, not precisely. It was more a stark realization of an absence, a gaping void in his own carefully curated life. He had convinced himself that his solitude was a choice, a preference for quietude. But as the months wore on, and Sebastian's vibrant life continued to unfold just across the hall, Milo found himself wrestling with a subtle, persistent loneliness that whispered, "Is this truly all there is?" The wall of silence, once a comfort, now felt like an impenetrable barrier. A knock in the rain. The rain began as a gentle patter against his window, a soothing rhythm that usually lulled Milo into a contemplative state. Tonight, however, it escalated with an alarming speed, transforming into a violent downpour that rattled the panes and hissed against the brickwork of the building. The wind, a fierce accomplice, whistled through unseen cracks, making the old apartment feel less like a sanctuary and more like a besieged fortress. Milo had been meticulously organizing his collection of first editions, a ritual he found both calming and creatively inspiring. The storm, though, was a disruptive force, pulling his attention away from the delicate spines and dog-eared pages. He'd just placed a particularly rare copy of a Victorian novel back on its shelf when a sound cut through the tempest's roar. Knock! 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 Milo froze. His hand, still hovering over the bookshelf, twitched. He wasn't expecting anyone. He rarely did. The sound came again, louder this time, insistent, almost urgent. It wasn't the tentative rap of a delivery person, nor the familiar, rhythmic tap of the building manager. This was a firm, deliberate series of blows against his door, an intrusion into his carefully curated solitude. Who on earth would be out in this weather, let alone knocking on his door at this hour? The digital clock on his antique radio glowed 11:47 p.m. He hesitated, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. His first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend he wasn't home. But the knocking persisted, a relentless beat against the wood. With a sigh that felt heavier than usual, Milo padded across the plush rug of his living room, the Persian weave muffling his footsteps. He peered through the peephole, a tiny, distorted lens onto the world outside his apartment. Through the watery distortion, he saw a figure, hunched against the torrent. A flash of lightning momentarily illuminated the landing, revealing a shock of dark, wet hair plastered across a forehead, and a familiar, if slightly panicked, expression. It was Sebastian. Milo blinked, then blinked again. Sebastian. Here, at his door, the gregarious, effortlessly charming Sebastian, whose comings and goings had become a silent, unwitting chronicle for Milo, was now a tangible presence, standing right outside his personal space. He unlocked the multiple locks, a habit born of an overly cautious nature, and slowly opened the door, a sliver at first, then wider, revealing Sebastian in his full, rain-soaked glory. Sebastian looked different. His usual polished demeanor was gone, replaced by a disheveled vulnerability. His light blue shirt, usually impeccable, clung to his chest, dark with water. His hair dripped onto his brow, and his eyes, usually sparkling with an easy confidence, held a bewildered, almost apologetic glint. In one hand he clutched a mangled, inverted umbrella, its skeletal spokes protruding at odd angles, a casualty of the storm. Milo? Sebastian's voice was a little rough, slightly breathless as if he'd run through the deluge. God, sorry to bother you so late. I know it's crazy, but I'm in a bit of a predicament. He gestured vaguely to the ruined umbrella, then to the general wetness of his being. A droplet of water traced a path down his cheek, indistinguishable from a tear in the dim light. Milo found his voice, a little rusty from disuse. Sebastian, what happened? Sebastian offered a weak, self-deprecating smile. Attempted to brave the elements, clearly failed. And now I'm baking, or trying to. And I realized, a little too late, that I'm completely out of sugar. Like, not a grain. And everything's closed, obviously. He paused, looking genuinely embarrassed. So, I was just hoping. You wouldn't happen to have a cup of sugar, would you? Milo stared at him, the request hanging in the air like an absurd offering. Sugar. After all the silent observations, the internal monologues about Sebastian's vibrant life, the profound sense of his own quiet solitude. The first direct interaction was about a mundane baking ingredient. It was so utterly unexpected, so incongruous with the grander narratives Milo had constructed around his neighbor. Sugar? Milo repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. Sebastian nodded, a hopeful puppy dog expression replacing the embarrassment. Just a cup. To save my... Well, it's a cheesecake. A very important cheesecake. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Milo's lips. A very important cheesecake. It was so Sebastian. He stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in, he said, the words feeling alien, yet not entirely unwelcome. You're dripping everywhere. Sebastian hesitated for a moment, as if surprised by the invitation, then stepped over the threshold, bringing with him the scent of wet wool and rain-soaked earth. He stood awkwardly on the welcome mat, water puddling around his shoes. Milo turned, walking towards his small, meticulously organized kitchen. I think I have some. Granulated, I assume? Perfect, Sebastian said, his voice regaining a touch of its usual resonance, though still laced with a hint of relief. Milo retrieved a bag of sugar from the pantry, scooping out a generous cupful into a clean, empty container. When he turned back, Sebastian was still standing by the door, wringing out the fabric of his ruined umbrella, looking like a lost boy. The flickering light from the hallway seemed to exaggerate the dark circles under his eyes, the slight slump of his shoulders. Milo held out the container. Here you go. Sebastian took it, his fingers brushing against Milo's for a fleeting second. The touch was brief, accidental, yet it sent a strange jolt through Milo, a sensation he hadn't anticipated. Thank you, Milo, Sebastian said, his gaze meeting Milo's directly, and in that moment, the usual playful glint in his eyes was replaced by something softer, more sincere. Really, you're a lifesaver. He managed a grateful smile. No problem, Milo replied, feeling a surprising warmth spread through him. Sebastian shifted, already turning towards the door. Well, I'll let you get back to whatever you were doing, and I'll bring this back tomorrow, and maybe a slice of cheesecake, if it turns out. No need, Milo started, but Sebastian was already opening the door, stepping back out into the relentless downpour. I insist, Sebastian called over his shoulder, a flash of his usual charming bravado returning, even as he was swallowed by the darkness and the rain. Good night, Milo. And just like that, he was gone. The door clicked shut, plunging Milo's apartment back into its familiar quiet, save for the furious drumming of the rain. Milo stood there for a long moment, the faint scent of rain and Sebastian's presence still lingering in the air. He looked at the closed door, then at his hand, where Sebastian's fingers had briefly brushed his own. The unexpected knock in the rain had left more than just puddles on his mat. It had left a subtle ripple in the placid surface of his solitude. He wondered about the cheesecake. And more pressingly, he wondered about tomorrow. The nightly ritual begins. The following evening, a quiet descended upon Milo Street, a stark contrast to the previous night's tempest. He found himself, for the first time in memory, not quite settling into his usual after-dinner routine. He'd placed his teacup down a little too carefully, his hand hovering over the spine of a first edition a moment longer than necessary. An unfamiliar ripple of expectation had settled in his chest, a sensation both unwelcome and undeniably present. Just as the last vestiges of twilight faded from the sky, a familiar rhythm tapped against his door. 2 quick raps, a pause, then a softer third. Milo's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Milo? It's Sebastian again. The voice was a little less boisterous than the night before, tinged with a faint sheepishness. Milo opened the door. Sebastian stood there, a lopsided grin on his face, a hand rubbing the back of his neck. He looked less disheveled than during the storm, but the same hint of vulnerability lingered in his eyes. Hey, sorry to bother you again. It's a bit embarrassing, really. My kitchen light just went out, totally dark. Any chance you have a spare light bulb? Just a standard one? Milo stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. He retrieved a new bulb from the utility closet and handed it over. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt up Milo's arm. You're a lifesaver, Milo. Again, Sebastian said, his grin widening. Seriously, I owe you. Big time. He vanished back into the night, leaving Milo standing in his doorway, a faint warmth radiating from his hand where Sebastian had touched it. The next night, it was a corkscrew. Sebastian had apparently just bought a new bottle of wine, only to discover his own was broken. The night after that, a single AA battery for his remote control. Then, a dash of paprika for a late-night chili, a small measuring spoon for a forgotten ingredient, a recommendation for a trustworthy plumber, a quick opinion on the aesthetics of a newly acquired piece of art. The reasons were always small, always mundane, always delivered with that same blend of charming self-deprecation and genuine need. Milo found himself anticipating the knocks. The familiar rhythm became a silent countdown, a punctuation mark in his otherwise solitary evenings. He'd finish his tea, close his book, and then, a few minutes later, the gentle rapping would begin. Sometimes, he'd already be halfway to the door, a small, involuntary smile playing on his lips. He started noticing other things too. The parade of women who used to grace Sebastian's doorstep, their laughter echoing up the stairwell, had dwindled. For a while, there was just a trickle, then a noticeable absence. Sebastian's apartment, once a beacon of lively music and late-night chatter, was quieter now. The sounds that did emanate from it were different. The low hum of a television, the clinking of dishes, the occasional strum of a guitar, a melody Milo hadn't heard before. The silence from Sebastian's place was almost as impactful as the new routine of his visits. It was as if a spotlight had shifted, away from the glittering performance of his social life and onto the quieter, more intimate exchanges at Milo's door. Milo hadn't realized how much he'd subconsciously catalogued the comings and goings next door until their absence became so pronounced. One evening, Sebastian arrived needing a small pair of pliers. He lingered longer than usual, leaning against the doorframe, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, Milo, he said, his gaze sweeping over the shelves of books. It's weird, but I kind of look forward to these little emergencies now. Milo simply hummed in response, his heart doing a curious little flutter. He tried to project an air of disinterest, a practiced neutrality, but inside, a new and unfamiliar feeling bloomed. It was a delicate thing, like the first tentative shoots of spring after a long winter, pushing through the cold earth. Anticipation, a quiet, almost shy joy. Sebastian straightened up, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before he offered his usual charming grin. Thanks again, Milo. You're really saving my bacon on a nightly basis. He left, the pliers clutched in his hand, and Milo closed the door, the scent of Sebastian's faint cologne lingering in the air. The nightly ritual had begun, and with each knock, with each shared moment, however brief, Milo felt the carefully constructed walls of his solitude shifting, subtly, imperceptibly, making room for something new. He didn't know what it was, or where it was leading, but for the first time in a long time, The prospect of the unknown didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with a curious, quiet hope, more than just favors. The clink of the wind chimes on the porch next door, a sound Milo had once barely registered, now served as an evening bell, signaling the approaching hour. He'd find himself lingering in the kitchen, wiping down an already clean counter or adjusting the spines of his books, feigning preoccupation while his senses strained for the familiar, light tread on the flagstones. The requests for butter or a charger had grown less frequent, replaced by something far more unsettling in its simplicity. One Tuesday night, a soft tap, not the insistent rap of before, echoed through his quiet living room. Milo opened the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the porch light switch, but hesitated. Sebastian stood there, not holding an empty container or a dead phone, but simply standing. His usually tousled hair was neatly combed, and his t-shirt, while casual, was free of wrinkles. The lingering scent of something fresh, not the usual melange of perfume and stale smoke, drifted from him. "Good evening, Milo," Sebastian said, his voice a low murmur against the chirping crickets. There was no preamble, no fumbled explanation for his presence, just the greeting. Milo blinked, momentarily at a loss. He found himself searching Sebastian's face for the usual hint of an impending request, a subtle plea in his eyes, but there was nothing, only a quiet, expectant gaze. "Good evening, Sebastian," Milo replied, the words feeling clumsy on his tongue. A small smile, almost imperceptible, touched Sebastian's lips. "Just wanted to say good night." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Milo's neatly buttoned shirt and the faint line of flour on his cheek from his evening baking. "Sleep well, Milo." And with that, he turned and descended the 2 porch steps, melting back into the shadows of his own yard. Milo stood there for a long moment, the cool evening air raising goosebumps on his arms. The silence that followed Sebastian's departure felt different, not empty, but resonant, humming with an unfamiliar warmth. The good nights became a new ritual. Sometimes Sebastian would mention a particularly stubborn weed in his flower bed, or the surprising chill in the air. "You ever notice how the crickets sound different when a storm's coming?" he'd ask one evening, leaning against the doorframe, his hands tucked into his pockets. Milo, who had indeed noticed, found himself nodding. "Higher pitched," he offered, surprised by the ease with which the words left him. "Almost frantic." Sebastian hummed in agreement, his eyes fixed on the distant streetlights. Always found that comforting somehow, like the world's just doing what it's supposed to. These were not the deep, philosophical discussions Milo imagined other people had. They were threads, gossamer thin, but strong enough to connect 2 previously isolated points. They spoke of the changing seasons, the neighborhood stray cat, the frustratingly slow growth of Sebastian's new herb garden. Milo, who usually found social interaction draining, discovered a strange lightness in these exchanges. There was no pressure, no expectation beyond shared observation. He learned that Sebastian preferred his coffee black, and that he hummed off-key when he was concentrating. Sebastian, in turn, learned of Milo's meticulous baking habits and his preference for the quiet hum of classical music in the evenings. He started leaving his porch light on, not just when he expected Sebastian, but from dusk onwards. It was a silent invitation, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. He'd catch glimpses of Sebastian's silhouette from his living room window, a brief pause at the edge of his own yard, before the familiar tap at the door. One evening, after a particularly blustery day, Sebastian arrived, smelling faintly of damp earth and wood smoke, a faint smudge on his cheek. "Rough day in the garden?" Milo asked, a small smile playing on his lips. Sebastian sighed, a sound of genuine weariness, and leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the doorframe. You have no idea. The roses are staging a rebellion. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that resonated in Milo's chest. But at least it's done. He straightened, meeting Milo's gaze. Your light's always on now. Milo felt a blush creep up his neck. It's easier to see, he mumbled, a flimsy excuse he knew Sebastian saw right through. Sebastian's smile widened, softening the sharp angles of his face. It's nice, he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. Feels welcoming. He lingered a moment longer, his eyes seeming to hold a silent question before a final, gentle, "Good night, Milo," sent him back into the night. Milo closed the door, the scent of earth and wood smoke still clinging to the air. The quiet warmth that now settled over him was a stranger, yet he found himself embracing it. It wasn't just anticipation anymore. It was something akin to a quiet joy, a feeling that bloomed in the space Sebastian had carved out in his meticulously ordered world. His solitude, once a comfortable blanket, now felt thin, almost transparent, allowing the faintest hint of another's presence to seep in and fill the empty spaces. Shared silences. The good night stretched. What began as a fleeting exchange, a mere punctuation mark at the end of Sebastian's day, gradually expanded into something more substantial. Milo would still be on his porch, a book resting unread in his lap, the chill of the evening a welcome companion. Sebastian, after seeing his latest visitor to the curb, wouldn't immediately retreat into his brightly lit home. Instead, his gaze would drift across the manicured lawn, lingering on Milo's solitary figure. One evening, he didn't just linger. He crossed the short expanse, a hesitant smile playing on his lips. Mind if I sit for a bit? Milo, startled but not unwelcome, gestured to the empty wicker chair beside him. Please. Sebastian settled in, the cushions sighing softly beneath him. The air, usually thick with the buzzing of unseen insects and the distant hum of traffic, now held a new weight, a comfortable, expectant silence. They watched the sky bleed from bruised violet to inky black, the first tentative pinpricks of starlight appearing above the towering oaks. There was no need for conversation, no awkward fumbling for topics. The quiet was a language in itself, understood and appreciated. The next night, the pattern repeated, and the night after that. Soon, it wasn't an invitation, but an unspoken understanding. Sebastian would arrive, sometimes with a half-empty bottle of sparkling water, sometimes just with the day's lingering energy, and take his place. Milo found himself looking forward to it, a subtle shift in his internal clock marking the approach of Sebastian's departure from his dates, and then the familiar footsteps on his pathway. One particularly clear night, the stars were a dazzling tapestry, flung across the heavens with reckless abandon. Sebastian leaned back, his head tilted upwards, a soft sigh escaping his lips. Never really stopped to look at them before, he murmured, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. Always too busy, I guess. Milo simply hummed in agreement, his own gaze lost in the cosmic display. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fading heat of the day. This was new, this feeling of quiet companionship with another soul. It was a revelation, a soft unfolding in the tightly wound coils of his solitary life. He felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally. With Sebastian, there was no pressure to perform, no need for witty banter or intellectual discourse, just shared breathing, shared space, and the shared wonder of the night sky. He found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't realized he'd forgotten how to. His shoulders perpetually hunched, began to ease. The knot that often resided between his brows loosened. Happiness, a gentle, unassuming kind of happiness, began to bloom in the quiet corners of his heart. Sebastian, for his part, seemed to appreciate the respite. The boisterous energy he projected when entertaining was replaced by a more subdued, almost vulnerable air. He'd occasionally fidget with a loose thread on his shirt or trace patterns on the armrest of the chair. But mostly, he was still, present. Milo observed the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his shoulders would drop, shedding the day's obligations like an unwanted cloak. One evening, a particularly bright meteor streaked across the sky, leaving a momentary silver scar. Sebastian let out a soft gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. He turned to Milo, his eyes wide, reflecting the distant glow of the streetlights. "Did you see that?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly would break the spell. Milo nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Beautiful." Sebastian held his gaze for a beat longer than usual, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. "Yeah," he said, his voice soft as still. "It was." He didn't elaborate, didn't try to intellectualize the moment. He simply savored it, and Milo savored it with him. These shared silences, these unspoken acknowledgements of beauty and presence, were weaving a new tapestry into the fabric of Milo's existence. He hadn't realized how deeply lonely he had been until Sebastian's quiet presence began to fill that void. It wasn't a gaping wound, but a persistent ache, a low thrum of absence that he had grown so accustomed to. He'd almost forgotten it was there. Now, with Sebastian beside him, the ache receded, replaced by a gentle hum of connection. The nights grew cooler, the stars sharper. Sometimes Sebastian would stay for an hour, sometimes longer. He never pushed for conversation, never demanded anything beyond what Milo silently offered, a shared moment, a comfortable space. And in return, Milo felt a quiet blossoming within him, a tender shoots of joy pushing through the hardened earth of his solitude. He was becoming less Milo the hermit and more Milo the man who shared his porch with Sebastian. And for the first time in a very long time, that thought didn't fill him with dread, but with a quiet, undeniable contentment. Confusion and retreat evenings on Milo's porch had become Sebastian's quiet harbor. After the boisterous laughter, the clinking glasses, the practiced charm of a night out, it was Milo's unassuming presence that grounded him. He'd arrive, sometimes trailing the ghost of another's perfume, sometimes just with a weary smile, and simply be. He'd trace constellations with Milo, listen to the cricket's symphony, and feel an unfamiliar calm unfurl within him. Lately, though, that calm was shot through with a sharp, unsettling current. Milo wasn't just a porch companion. He permeated Sebastian's days. A certain twilight hue brought Milo's garden to mind. A sudden hush in a crowded room would prompt a fleeting thought of Milo. And those steady, kind eyes, the gentle curve of Milo's smile when Sebastian shared a rare, quiet observation. These sent a jolt through him, a sensation entirely separate from friendship, a feeling too potent to name. Its novelty was almost painful, and it terrified him. One Tuesday, after a particularly forgettable date, Sebastian found himself on autopilot towards Milo's. A few yards from the fence, he froze. The porch light cast a warm invitation. He could almost feel Milo's patient vigil. A wave of panic seized him. This raw, undeniable yearning was too much. He couldn't face Milo tonight, not with this turmoil raging. He spun around, heart hammering, and retreated to his own house, leaving Milo's porch light burning, a silent, Lonely beacon. Milo waited. He tracked the shifting street shadows, listened for the familiar crunch of Sebastian's boots on gravel. The night deepened. The air grew cool, but Sebastian didn't appear. Perhaps a late night, Milo reasoned, or an uncharacteristic early return home. Just one night. He extinguished the lantern, the sudden darkness feeling unusually heavy, and went inside, a faint tremor of disappointment disturbing his hard-won peace. The next night, Sebastian remained absent. And the night after that, the comforting ritual of shared silence dissolved, leaving a gaping void. Milo's evenings, once imbued with anticipation, now felt stark and barren. He paced his living room, his gaze straying towards Sebastian's dark house. Had he misspoken? Caused offense? The questions gnawed, reawakening the familiar pang of isolation he'd believed vanquished. He missed the faint click of Sebastian's gait, the almost imperceptible sigh as Sebastian settled into the opposite chair. He missed the way Sebastian might point out a distant star or remark on the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine. The profound tranquility Sebastian's presence had offered had receded, leaving Milo exposed and profoundly sad. Meanwhile, Sebastian was adrift. He shunned his own porch, inventing excuses to stay out late or retreating to his secluded back garden. His phone buzzed with Clara's insistent texts, demanding answers. He knew he was a coward, but confronting Milo, risking that overwhelming surge of feeling again, was unthinkable. He couldn't comprehend his own reaction. He'd never felt this way about anyone, least of all a man. The confusion was a thick, suffocating fog, clouding his judgment, making him irritable and withdrawn. Finally, Clara cornered him at the local coffee shop. "Sebastian, what on earth is wrong with you?" she demanded, hands on her hips. "You're twitchier than a cat on a hot tin roof, and you haven't been yourself for days. 3 dates cancelled, no returned calls." Sebastian sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "It's nothing, Clara. Just a lot on my mind." "Nothing?" she scoffed. "You look like you've seen a ghost. And spare me the busy excuse. You never miss a chance to unwind on Milo's porch after a date." "Speaking of Milo, I haven't seen you there in ages. Everything all right?" Her eyes, usually sparkling with playful mischief, were now sharp with concern. Sebastian froze, his carefully constructed facade threatening to crumble. "Milo's fine," he mumbled, averting his gaze. "I just haven't felt like going over." "Haven't felt like it?" Clara's voice softened, losing its edge. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Sebastian, you practically lived on that man's porch. You found something there, didn't you? Something important." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Is this about Milo?" Sebastian pushed back from the table, his chest scraping loudly. "Clara, please, I just need some space." He strode out, leaving Clara watching him, a worried frown etched on her face. He simply couldn't articulate the tempest within. It was easier to retreat, to hide, than to confront the unsettling truth of what Milo had become to him. Milo, meanwhile, sat alone on his porch, the pervasive scent of night-blooming jasmine, a bittersweet echo of shared evenings. The silence pressed down, heavy and oppressive, a stark contrast to the comfortable quiet he'd grown to cherish. He missed Sebastian with an intensity that startled him, an ache in his chest mirroring the loneliness he'd believed banished. He looked at Sebastian's dark house, a knot tightening in his stomach. What if Sebastian never came back? The return. The days that followed Sebastian's abrupt disappearance stretched into an eternity, each one mirroring the last in its bleak, quiet solitude. Milo's meticulously arranged routines, once a source of comfort, now felt like a cruel mockery. He still made 2 cups of tea each evening, the habit ingrained, but one inevitably grew cold, untouched. The porch swing, once the epicenter of their shared silence, now creaked forlornly in the evening breeze, a constant reminder of what was missing. He found himself replaying their last interactions, searching for a misstep, a word he'd uttered that might have driven Sebastian away. Had he overstepped? Been too quiet? Not quiet enough? The questions spun in an endless loop, each answer more elusive than the last. The world, once vibrant with the promise of Sebastian's presence, had dulled to a muted grey. Then, on the 6th evening, just as the last sliver of orange bled from the sky and the first fireflies began to dance in the twilight, a sound cut through the oppressive quiet. 2 distinct, unhurried knocks echoed through his small house. Milo froze, his hand hovering over the kettle. His heart, which had felt like a stone for days, lurched, a confusing mixture of hope and a terrible, gnawing anxiety blooming in his chest. It couldn't be. Could it? He moved towards the door as if in a dream, each step heavy with trepidation. He peered through the peephole, his breath catching in his throat. It was him, Sebastian, standing on his porch, silhouetted against the deepening dusk, his shoulders hunched, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. He looked lost. Not the usual confident, easygoing Sebastian, but a man adrift. Milo slowly, almost reverently, unlatched the door and pulled it open. The evening air, cool and fragrant with the scent of honeysuckle, flowed into the house. Sebastian's gaze, usually so direct, skittered away, fixing instead on a point somewhere over Milo's shoulder. His face was drawn, shadows deepening beneath his eyes, and a faint stubble dusted his jaw. He looked as though he hadn't slept, hadn't truly rested. Milo? Sebastian's voice was a low murmur, rough around the edges, as if unused. He cleared his throat. I'm sorry. Milo said nothing, simply waiting, his own emotions a tangled knot in his chest. Relief warred with a cautious anger, a quiet hurt that Sebastian had simply vanished. Sebastian finally met his gaze, and in his eyes, Milo saw a vulnerability he hadn't witnessed before. I didn't mean to disappear like that. I couldn't. He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at Milo, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. I miss this. Our porch time. He swallowed hard. I missed you. The last word was barely a whisper, a stark admission that seemed to surprise Sebastian himself. It felt strange without it, without you. The silence stretched between them, no longer comfortable but thick with the weight of unspoken things. Milo felt a warmth spread through him at Sebastian's admission, a balm to the ache in his chest. But the underlying questions remained. Why had he left? What had driven him away? Sebastian shifted his weight, his discomfort palpable. Can we just sit? He gestured vaguely towards the porch swing, the unspoken plea clear in his eyes. Milo nodded, unable to articulate the tumultuous mix of feelings that surged within him. He stepped aside, allowing Sebastian to precede him. They settled onto the swing, the familiar creak a comfort, yet utterly changed. The space between them, once filled with a comfortable ease, now hummed with a nervous energy. Sebastian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring out into the dimming garden. I don't really know what happened, he confessed, his voice low. It just got too much. Everything. He exhaled slowly, A long, shaky breath. I've been thinking a lot about things, about us. He paused, searching for the right words, then shook his head again, frustrated. I don't even know what I'm talking about, truthfully. I just know I felt overwhelmed and then empty when I wasn't here. Milo listened, his gaze fixed on Sebastian's profile, the faint glow of the street lamp illuminating the tension in his jaw. He wanted to ask, to push for answers, but something in Sebastian's raw vulnerability held him back. It was clear Sebastian was grappling with something profound, something he couldn't articulate, perhaps couldn't even understand himself. The crickets began their nightly chorus, their rhythmic chirping filling the void. The distant hum of traffic provided a low thrum beneath a cicada's song. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. They sat there, two men on a porch swing, the familiar tableau infused with an entirely new emotional landscape. The comfortable silence had been replaced by a heavy quiet, pregnant with unaddressed emotions, with longing, and with a cautious, fragile hope that something, however uncertain, had returned. Milo reached for the tea he had prepared, now lukewarm, and took a small sip. He didn't offer Sebastian a cup. The gesture felt too ordinary for this extraordinary moment. He simply sat, breathing in Sebastian's presence, and waited. A gentle hand. Milo remained on the porch swing, the wood creaking softly under his weight, the silence stretching taut between them. The cicadas, a constant hum in the twilight, seemed to amplify the unspoken words hanging in the humid air. Sebastian, still perched on the edge of the step, kept his gaze fixed on the worn planks of the porch. His shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing for an impact. The apology had been delivered, a quiet admission of being overwhelmed, of missing Milo. But it felt incomplete, a single brushstroke on a canvas that demanded a masterpiece of explanation. Milo's chest tightened, a familiar ache of disappointment warring with a fragile tendril of relief. He wanted to reach out, to demand more, but the words felt lodged, thick and unyielding in his throat. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree overhead, casting dancing shadows across Sebastian's face. Milo watched him, cataloguing the subtle tremor in his hands, the faint tremor in his lower lip. This wasn't the confident, almost aloof Sebastian he'd first known, nor the playfully teasing Sebastian who had, in recent weeks, begun to dismantle the walls Milo had so carefully constructed. This was a man stripped bare, vulnerable and hesitant. Sebastian finally stirred, lifting his head. His eyes, usually a rich, fathomless brown, were clouded with an emotion Milo couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of fear and something akin to a desperate plea. He shifted, turning his body fully towards Milo, then slowly, almost hesitantly, extended his hand. It hovered for a moment, suspended in the space between them, before gently, reverently, covering Milo's left hand where it rested on his knee. The touch was a shock, a jolt of unexpected warmth that sent a shiver tracing down Milo's spine. It wasn't a firm grasp, not a comforting squeeze, but a tender, almost tentative press of skin against skin. Sebastian's fingers were cool, slightly calloused, and his thumb began to trace light, circling patterns on the back of Milo's hand. The simple gesture spoke volumes, a physical manifestation of a bridge being built, a silent apology more profound than any spoken word. Milo's breath hitched, and the tight knot in his chest began to loosen, just a fraction. He looked up, meeting Sebastian's gaze. The cloudiness in Sebastian's eyes had begun to dissipate, replaced by a nascent light, a flicker of something raw and unshielded. It was a look Milo hadn't seen before, not in the playful glint, not in the quiet comfort, not even in the bewildered confusion of their earlier encounters. This was a direct, unwavering stare, filled with a vulnerability that mirrored Milo's own. The air around them seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken tension, a fragile anticipation. Sebastian's lips parted, and a soft sigh escaped him. He tightened his grip on Milo's hand, a sudden, decisive action that pulled Milo's attention back to the present moment, to the undeniable connection blooming between them. He took a deep breath, his chest visibly expanding, as if gathering every ounce of courage he possessed. "Milo," he began, his voice a low murmur, a barely audible whisper against the hum of the cicadas. He paused, his gaze dropping to their joined hands for a fleeting second, then lifting back to Milo's eyes, unwavering and resolute. I think I love you." The words hung in the air, echoing in the sudden profound silence that enveloped them. The cicadas seemed to fall silent, the breeze stilled, the world outside their small porch shrinking to nothing. Milo's heart gave a violent lurch, skipping a beat before resuming a frantic, almost painful rhythm. The relief, the anger, the hurt, the hope, all the tangled emotions that had warred within him for the past 6 days coalesced into a single overwhelming sensation. A warmth spread through him, radiating from where Sebastian's hand still held his. A warmth that banished the lingering chill of solitude. The confession was unexpected, a tidal wave of emotion that threatened to engulf him. Yet in its raw honesty, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He simply stared, unable to speak, unable to move, completely captivated by the man before him, by the brave, fragile admission that had just reshaped his world. A shared smile. The confession, fragile as spun moonlight, shimmered in the humid night. Milo's breath hitched, a silent gasp that felt like a threshold crossed. His heart, a moment ago a tight knot of apprehension, now surged with a wild, almost painful elation. Sebastian's head remained bowed, his hand a warm, reassuring anchor in Milo's. The raw honesty in Sebastian's voice, the vulnerability etched on his features, dissolved Milo's carefully constructed detachment. A slow, irrepressible warmth bloomed within Milo, radiating outwards like ripples. A tremor began, a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth, blossoming into a wide, unburdened smile that reached his eyes, chasing away long-held shadows. It was pure, unadulterated happiness, a luminous beacon in the dim porch light. Words eluded him, caught behind the sheer magnitude of emotion, but his smile, he hoped, spoke volumes. With his thumb, Milo gently stroked the back of Sebastian's hand. Then, with a surge of affection-born courage, squeezed. It was a silent affirmation, a pledge, a heartfelt echo of Sebastian's revelation. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The light pressure conveyed everything Milo couldn't articulate: relief, understanding, and profound reciprocation. Sebastian's shoulders relaxed fractionally, as if the physical reassurance had been a lifeline. Slowly, he lifted his head, eyes still clouded with lingering uncertainty, meeting Milo's. That last vestige of doubt seemed to melt, absorbed by the radiant joy reflected in Milo's gaze. A small, tentative smile, a mirror of Milo's but tinged with shyness, touched Sebastian's lips. It was a shared smile, a silent conversation transcending words. The crickets in the overgrown bushes seemed to chirp with renewed vigor, the cicada's nightly chorus a celebratory hum. The air, heavy with night-blooming jasmine, felt sweeter, imbued with a fresh magic. They sat hand in hand on the old porch swing, its rhythmic creak a comforting counterpoint to the quiet thrum of their hearts. The world beyond their intimate bubble faded into a distant hum. The night's chill, which had previously pricked Milo's skin, was banished by an internal warmth radiating from their joined hands, suffusing his entire being. He felt lighter, as if a monumental, unrecognized burden had finally been lifted. The meticulous order of his life, once his fortress, now seemed a quaint, almost comical memory. This chaotic, beautiful feeling was infinitely preferable. Milo leaned his head back against the swing's wooden slats, his gaze drifting to the vast, star-dusted canvas of the night sky. Each star, usually a distant, indifferent pinprick, now shimmered with a newfound brilliance, winking conspiratorially at their shared secret. A profound sense of peace settled over him, a deep-seated contentment he hadn't known was possible. Sebastian shifted slightly, his thumb tracing absent patterns on Milo's knuckles, a subtle movement conveying burgeoning comfort, a quiet intimacy both new and profoundly familiar. The transaction of shared moments, the silent routines, the unspoken understanding. It had all culminated in this. This wasn't merely a confession. It was a foundational shift, a complete reordering of their individual universes into a shared, interconnected one. For Milo, this was an answer to a question he hadn't consciously known he was asking. The quiet hum of his solitary existence, once content, had been subtly, irrevocably altered by Sebastian's presence. Now, with this declaration, this undeniable bond, the quiet hum had become a symphony. He felt a sense of belonging he'd never experienced, a deep resonance with another soul, both exhilarating and terrifying. Terrifying because it meant letting go of cherished control, embracing vulnerability. Exhilarating because it promised a depth of connection he'd only ever dreamed of. He turned his head slightly, catching Sebastian's profile in the dim light. The sharp lines of Sebastian's jaw were softened, the usual tension in his brow absent. His eyes, fixed on some unseen point, held a quiet wonder, reflecting the profound shift. He seemed to be absorbing the moment, letting the enormity of his own honesty wash over him. The reserved neighbor, the man of fleeting glances and carefully constructed distance, was gone, replaced by someone open, tender, and undeniably, beautifully in love. Milo tightened his grip again, a silent promise that he was here, listening, feeling every bit of it too. The swing creaked gently, a lullaby under the vast, open sky. Words were no longer needed. The unspoken comfort, the shared love, the quiet understanding. It was all there, tangible and real, between them, under the watchful gaze of the stars. This was their beginning, bathed in the soft glow of the porch light, marked by a shared smile and a simple, heartfelt squeeze of a hand.